Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Organic or Regenerative, What Do These Terms Really Mean? My name's Katie Diesbecker. I am the Agriculture Extension Officer with LEPS. And joining me today is Emma Bryce, the Communications Manager with the Organic Federation of Canada. Before we get started, I would just like to ask that everyone keep their microphones muted, and you can leave your camera on if you would like, but this is being recorded and it will be on the LEPS YouTube page, so you may end up in the recording if you do. And also, before we start, I would just like to recognize that this event is being held on the unceded territory of the Kwantlen, Katzie, Matsqui, Semiahmoo, and Stolo Coast Salish Indigenous people. And with that said, I will turn it over to our speaker, Emma.
Hey, thanks so much, Katie. I see that we've got, a couple people who are maybe waiting to join. And so kind of while we're waiting for some last minute stragglers, I was hoping just to get a feel for who is joining us. So I don't know if people want to maybe just pop into the chat where you're joining from. And I'm really curious to know if you're a farmer, if so, what you farm, if you're a consumer that's just kind of interested in the topic. So if people want to let me know where everyone is from, that would be awesome.
There's one person saying, I'm from Chilliwack. I'm not a farmer, but I am interested in environmental conservation and learning more about agriculture. And one person says, Langley, I have a hobby farm.
Fantastic. That's awesome. I am also from Chilliwack, so hello. And so one of the other things that I wanted to do just kind of before we get started and I start talking is I had Katie kind of prepare a poll for us today, because I'm also curious, not just whether or not you're farming or whether you're just kind of a consumer that's interested in learning more about this topic, but what you already know about regenerative agriculture. So I don't know if you can set that up for us, Katie.
Sure, I'll send that poll out now.
And if there's anybody who has joined somewhat recently, I was just asking people to put into the chat where they're joining from, and if you're a farmer or you're just interested in learning more about the topic, a consumer, kind of give me an idea of who's joining us and what kind of an audience we have today.
One person said, not a farmer, but I like gardening.
I also like gardening. I was telling Katie before we joined the call today that I was really upset because it was such a beautiful day today and I did not get into my garden. So
well, it looks like everyone who's here has answered the poll.
Perfect.
So I'll just share those results with everyone.
Yeah.
It looks like most people are fairly new to the topic.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's what I was hoping for. I was hoping that we wouldn't have any regenerative agriculture experts in the room, although that's always good sometimes as well. Okay, so awesome. So we have a gardener in South Langley, Aldergrove area. Perfect. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Katie gave me a little bit of an introduction before, but for those of you who are new to the group, my name's Emma Bryce. I'd just like to mention that I am joining you today from the traditional lands and unceded territories of the Stolo peoples. I live out in Chilliwack, and I'm the communications manager for the Organic Federation of Canada, which is a nonprofit organic organization, and we primarily manage the maintenance, review, and interpretation of the Canadian organic standards. And then we also co-manage the delivery of the Organic Science Cluster Research Initiatives, which is like a national organic research program that is on a 5-year kind of program, and it's funded both by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as well as industry partners. So I get to deal a lot with a lot of the different organic research initiatives that are happening kind of nationwide. I'm also a small farmer, which is kind of the hat that I'm wearing tonight. I wanted to, mention that I do work in organics, but I really wanted to come to this conversation as a small farmer and somebody who's really interested in these different principles myself. So I have a small farm in the Columbia Valley, so just past Cultus Lake in Chilliwack. I farm pasture-raised heritage breeds of pigs. I have a small flock of very mixed poultry and also some sheep and some goats. I work with a couple different volunteer initiatives. So some of you who are joining us from Langley may know the Langley Sustainable Agriculture Foundation. I see that Carol is here, who is also on the Langley Sustainable Ag Foundation with me. And then I also have worked with the Fraser Valley Conservancy for many years, and then have been involved with different organizations like BC Young Farmers and then the Canadian Young Farmers Forum. So have definitely been working and involved in and around agriculture for the last decade or so now. And then I'm also doing my graduate research at this time. So I'm doing my master's of science, and I'm looking at native bumblebee pollination in blueberry fields. So if anyone wants to talk pollinators with me at any point in time, you just let me know or save it for the end. So yeah, so our presentation today is going to be looking at organic or regenerative. What do these terms really mean? And I think that this is very near and dear to my heart, not just because I work in organics, but also because I feel like the term regenerative is something that we are hearing so often now, especially as we start hearing governments talking about climate change policy. Regenerative agriculture has kind of become the newest buzzword in agriculture. And so I really just wanted to break down for everybody what regenerative means, what it means in terms of how does it compare to organic, and so kind of give you a little bit of a framework. I felt like it would be nice to start off with this quote from Wendell because I really love him. And I think that it kind of embodies this feeling of regenerative agriculture. So the care of the earth is our most ancient and most worthy, and after all, our most pleasing responsibility. To cherish what remains of it and to foster its renewal is our only hope. So a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to do a really brief overview of organic production in BC and then kind of in Canada, just to kind of set the stage, because even having worked in organics for the last couple of years, I personally find some of the intricacies of organic certification a little bit confusing. And then we'll get into what regenerative actually is, talk a little bit about how regenerative and organic agriculture compare. We'll look at some of the problematic labeling in terms of the use of the term regenerative. And then we're going to look at a couple different regenerative agriculture initiatives, and then kind of wrap it up looking forward. And then all of the initiatives that I talk about, I'll provide some links at the end of the discussion so that you get a chance to check them out yourselves, because some of them are really interesting. And then we'll have some time for some questions and answers. Feel free, if you have any questions along the way, or if I'm going too fast, just throw it in the chat and let me know. I have not done a presentation for a little while, so I feel like sometimes I can talk a little fast. But yeah, so starting off looking at organic production in Canada and BC, there's a couple different kind of like overarching themes that we look at that are really the guidelines for what organic production is. And so the foundation of organic production is really the Canadian organic standards, right? So these are the principles, the regulatory procedures, and the permitted substances that are used in organic production. And these standards apply to any agricultural product if it has an organic claim, if it's used in import or export, or any interprovincial trade. Any product that bears the Canada Organic logo, so you can see just this logo right here, it probably looks very familiar to all of you. Any logo bearing or anything that's bearing that logo has to fall underneath and has to fall in compliance with the Canadian Organic standards. And so the standards are composed of two parts. You have the general principles and managements, which are basically kind of the overarching guidelines. These are fairly extensive and really just give you the full rundown of everything that you can and cannot do within organic production systems. And then the second one is the permitted substances list. And so this is everything that is allowed to be used on an organic farm. And this is also a very extensive list. And it is something that gets kind of vetted very rigorously. The process for having things added onto the list is a very extensive one. So So they really do their due diligence in making sure that the permitted substance list is something that complies with the principles of organic production. So the Canadian organic standards, they're governed by federal legislation, and this is done underneath the Safe Food for Canadian regulations. And an interesting point that maybe some people don't know about the standards is that they're actually reviewed every 5 years. And so this is a process which my work does. So the Organic Federation of Canada is one of the primary kind of reviewers, or not necessarily reviewers, but they're one of the people who, or organizations who oversee the review. And this is done through a series of petitions. So you can submit a petition as a regular producer. And this gets delivered to a variety of working groups and technical committees that specialize in different areas. And these groups and committees are composed of industry experts, stakeholders, researchers, and they're really there to ensure that the standards remain relevant and up to date. And so the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, so CFIA, is the regulatory body who basically oversees and monitors and enforces the requirements of the Canada Organic Regime. And so the Canada Organic Regime, this is our national regulated system for organic products. It's our national organic certification system. And they ensure products that are being sold using the Canada Organic logo, that they have been certified by an accredited certification body, or in the case of organic imports, that they come from a system that's deemed as being equivalent by the CFIA. So when we're looking at equivalencies, we have the USDA, so that's their National Organic Program, and then the Canadian Organic Regime, and then the European Union Organic Program. They have organic equivalency agreements, and this basically allows products from any of these countries to be sold as organic interchangeably. So it kind of streamlines a lot of this process. One of the other things that the Canada Organic Regime does is that it verifies the various different accreditation or certification bodies that exist underneath it. And so when you're looking at organics, and where it can get a little bit confusing, is that you have certification verification bodies, which are kind of like these overarching regulatory bodies that then underneath them oversee certification bodies, who are the ones who actually go out and ensure that all of the different regulations are being followed on farms. And so the other thing that we have here, and that where I think that things get confused a little bit more, especially when you're looking at logos in the store, is that you also have the BC Certified Organic Program. And so while the Canada Organic Regime is the national program, different provinces and territories also at times will have their own provincial certifications. And so essentially what this means, they're still following the Canadian organic standards, which I think is an important point to note. But the only kind of difference between these is that the products that are using this label, and so farms that are certified using this label, can only be sold in BC. So you cannot have any interprovincial sales that happen if you're using the BC Certified Organic Program. One of the reasons that farmers might do this, especially this is one that's really attractive to smaller farms, but if they don't want to sell outside of the province, they typically pay lower certification fees if they're going under the BCCOP program. So that's like a very quick and dirty explanation of organic production in Canada or BC and BC. So a little bit about what regenerative agriculture is. This is a really interesting kind of topic because in essence, there's no single definition of regenerative agriculture. And I think it's also important to note that there's actually no legal or regulatory one. There isn't even really a widely accepted definition of regenerative agriculture that has kind of emerged from common usage. If you look at various different research papers, you know, we have these kind of vague ideas of what regenerative agriculture is. And in a lot of cases, the exact definition of the term, it changes, depends on what sources you're looking at. But I do think that there are some really core principles that are overarching and unanimous regardless of where you're looking. And so some of these principles are, or I should say the majority of these principles, they're really focused on soil health. And so it's this idea of building or rebuilding, really, in cases where perhaps it has been lost, vibrant communities of soil life. So the goal is to add to the soil, not to take away, or even just to have things remain the same, right? Like you want to make sure that you are adding or regenerating your soil. So when we're looking at these kind of key principles, I picked out 4 that I think I found, and I have found really come across regardless of where you're looking. So the first one is this idea of not disturbing the soil. So this refers to minimizing soil disturbance. This is through things like no-till gardening or reduced tillage in order to support this really complex network of vertebrate, invertebrate, fungal, microorganisms, as well as your natural soil composition and aggregates. We think about tillage, I think, most commonly when we're looking at not disturbing the soil, but it's also really important to note that heavy synthetic fertilizer and pesticide use also really damages these living systems and structures. So that gets kind of added into this one as well. And then the second one is this idea of keeping the soil surface covered. And so this is a big one, right? So bare soil is really susceptible to damage from erosion, runoff, high water events, and a huge number of other stressors. Climate change has definitely been pushing a lot of our agricultural soils to the brink. And so keeping the soil blanketed in things like cover crops, making sure that you have crop rotations, green manures. So when you're adding a cover crop and then you're planting directly into that and allowing that cover crop to become the manure for your soil, and also things like organic mulches. All of these different practices are going to really reduce the impact of various stressors and help protect your soil ecosystems. The third one is growing a diverse range of crops. And so this, in essence, is biodiversity at its finest, right? Avoiding monoculture plantings, things like companion planting, diverse crop rotations again, but also practices like interseeding. So if you have a particular crop, and then you can interseed with a different variety that's going to be complementary to it. Practicing silvopasture. So this would be, when you're growing crops in combination with either trees or shrubs that are also going to produce a crop for you. Or even things like integrating woody vegetation into your farm through the use of things like hedgerows or shelter belts, anything to really promote this idea of on-farm biodiversity and create kind of a more complex agro-ecosystem. It really is, when you think about it, that metaphor of the forest, where a forest is a very diverse system. And so when you have pests that enter your forests, they may find one or two things that they're able to feed on, but you're never going to have everything wiped out because of one particular pest. And so you never really have these weaknesses, right? So having a farm that is diverse gives you a built-in system of checks and balances in order to allow your crops to be more resilient, both to the impacts of climate change, but especially also pest pressures. And then 4 is this idea of bringing and integrating grazing animals back to your land. So integrating grazing livestock into pasture rotations. This is kind of the idea where you implement practices such as mob grazing or intensive rotational grazing. So that would be if you have grazing animals where you would graze them in a very small area for a very short period of time, and then you flip them on to the next section and the next section and the next section, so that by the time they get back to the first one, it has had a full amount of time to be able to regenerate itself and regrow. In perennial forage crops specifically, this is really important, grassland ecosystems, because it allows for the more natural cycle of how grasslands would have originally been managed, right? So you would have had herds of grazing bison or grazing animals, and they would be in one area in very large numbers, and then they would move on. And so this kind of mimics the same system, and it fertilizes the area, and then it allows for the appropriate amount of regeneration in terms of growth before the animals come back to it. So this has been shown to be really beneficial. I think with this one, for farms that aren't that are more crop based and don't necessarily have a livestock focus, I think you can still integrate this aspect into it, but that can be thought of maybe more in terms of integrating livestock manure as fertilizer rather than using synthetic fertilizers. So I think that there's kind of different ways that this one in particular can be interpreted. Some of the other aspects of regenerative farming that get talked about in different kind of circles is this idea of animal welfare. There are kind of like these 5 freedoms that are thought of when we talk about animal welfare. So this would be the freedom from discomfort, the freedom from fear, and then the freedom from distress, freedom from hunger, from pain and injury or disease. And then one that I find particularly important is the freedom to express normal behavior, right? So this would be, raising pigs without the use of gestation or farrowing crates, allowing poultry access to be able to scratch and to feed on bugs. This is also the idea of making sure that animals are grass-fed and pasture-raised. Another one is limited transport. So this would be in between the farm and slaughter facilities. This one is a little bit difficult in BC, but I know that we have definitely made recent regulatory steps to be able to make this a little bit more manageable in terms of our on-farm slaughter regulations. But that's kind of like one of the main aspects of it is limiting transport. And if you can slaughter on farm, then that's even better. No CAFOs, which are the concentrated animal feeding operations, so any of your feedlots, and then kind of like as a complement to this idea of grass-fed and pasture-raised, is also having suitable shelters. So if your animals are going to be outside and they're going to be on pasture, while it's important to have them being able to express these natural behaviors, they also need to have shelter from the elements. So from things like rain and wind and snow and all of that, that's a pretty necessary aspect of animal welfare as well. And then the other one is worker or social fairness. And so this is looking at things like capacity building, fair payments for farmers, good working conditions, living wages, long-term commitments, no forced labor. And then I think also an important one is this idea of transparency and accountability. I think that COVID is something that has kind of brought this idea of temporary foreign worker programs a little bit more into the forefront. And I think it's a really good conversation to be having. It's this idea of so much of our food is produced through these types of systems. And so making sure that these systems are fair and democratic and provide a degree of social justice. So these are kind of some of the lesser thought of when it comes to regenerative agriculture, but I think that they do also play a really important part in it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how regenerative and organic practices kind of compare when you put them on paper. And so given what we just talked about, which were these ideas of soil health, when we're looking at things like cover cropping, not disturbing the soil, promoting biodiversity, integrating livestock, and then also these concepts of animal welfare and worker fairness. So when we're looking at the Canadian organic standards, there's a number of sections that fall kind of directly under the regenerative principles that we talked about. So 5.4, section 5.4 of the Canadian organic standards is looking at soil fertility and nutrient management. And this specifies that organic farmers must establish and maintain soil fertility by preserving and increasing soil organic matter. And it's also aiming for optimal balance of nutrients and stimulating soil biological activity. So a lot of these kind of concepts are directly written into the standards. The aspect of soil fertility is promoted through crop rotation, and this includes green manures, catch crops, legumes, or deep-rooted plants. And then the use of compost and animal manure is really encouraged, as well as tillage that maintains the physical and chemical and biological condition of the soil. So while tillage is still an aspect of organic farming, they do want to make sure that it's something that's done kind of conscientiously, where it maintains some of these major characteristics. And so one of the other things that's mentioned in the standard is that organic farmers are really required to minimize the damage to soil structure and prevent erosion. When it comes to biodiversity, organic management practices have to include measures to promote and protect ecosystem health on the farm. This can include things like maintaining or incorporating wildlife, pollinator habits, and maintaining and or restoring things like riparian areas and wetlands. When we're looking at animal welfare, there's specific standards that relate to animals needing to be treated with care, and that stress and suffering needs to be minimized. So like I said, the standards are revised every 5 years. And so the latest revision of the standards happened in 2020, and it came with a lot of updates for animal welfare. These were things like when it came to poultry farms, outdoor areas for chickens and turkeys, so that they have to have shade and protection from predators, which I think is a little bit of a no-brainer, but it was never specifically stated. So these are the kind of things that get added into the standards to make sure that producers have to follow them. Laying hens, they have to have access to enriched verandas whenever they're not able to go outside. But for all of these different types of poultry operations, they have kind of minimum requirements of how long these animals have to be able to have access to the outdoors for. Things like greater space requirements for indoor shelters for sheep and goats. You're no longer allowed to dehorn cattle, which was a new one in the 2020 standards. And then a bit of a controversial one, which I was really glad to see, is a phase out of tie stalls for dairy cattle, which has been it's been a really controversial one. If you look at Eastern Canada, there's still a lot of tie stalls that remain in the dairy industry, and so this one had a lot of pushback. But I think that it was a well fought battle. And then improved requirements for outdoor areas for pigs. So every time the standards gets reviewed, you do see a lot of these different kind of initiatives that are put forward. But I do think that there's still a lot of work to be done in this area. And then when it comes to worker fairness for the Canadian organic standards, this is essentially absent. So in the 2020 publication, there was a statement that was added on worker fairness, and it essentially said that the inclusion of regulations directed towards worker fairness was something that's going to be discussed during the 2025 review process. While 2025 sounds very far away, we're actually in the process of organizing the 2025 review process now. So I think that it's a good time to be having these discussions. And I think that we will see something on this one way or another when it comes to the next publication of the Canadian Organic Standards. So I think all in all, when it comes to organic and how regenerative is organic production, there are some definite areas of improvement, but the Canadian Organic Standards really do integrate a lot of these key principles of regenerative agriculture into its framework. And I think that you can see that mostly when it comes to the general principles of organic agriculture. So these are things like organic agriculture should be able to sustain and enhance the health of soil and plants, animals, and humans. There's a principle of ecology where organic agriculture should be based on living ecological systems and cycles. It should work with them, emulate them, and help sustain them. There's a principle of care where it should be managed in a precautionary and responsible manner in order to protect the health and well-being of current and future generations in the environment. So I think in a lot of ways, organic agriculture is kind of the foundation of what regenerative agriculture is looking at. So this is where I think it gets a little bit controversial, perhaps, and kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to have this discussion is I think that it can be said that there's a little bit of a problem, not with regenerative principles, but with the term regenerative. This is something that we are seeing a lot these days, and it's kind of become the latest greenwashing phrase, the latest buzzword. And so I really wanted to just bring a little bit to light about some of the corporations or big ag corporations that have claim to be making the switch to regenerative. And I shouldn't say claimed just as of yet, because that remains to be seen. But I do think it's important to note that, so the first one started off in 2019. We had General Mills, where they announced that they would be sourcing a portion of their crops from farmers engaging in regenerative agriculture practices. And they committed to advancing the practice of regenerative agriculture on 1 million acres by 2030. One of the more recent ones was Pepsi, where they announced that they were going to be adopting regenerative agriculture practices on 7 million acres of its farmland. Cargill was another big one. So they jumped on the bandwagon, saying that they intend to do the same with 10 million acres by 2030. And then Walmart has also committed to advancing this practice on 50 million acres. Other companies that have committed to similar claims are Danone, Unilever, and Target, among quite a few others. So I think that the co-opting of the term regenerative by big ag corporations is a little bit problematic, specifically because, as I mentioned before, there's no regulatory framework for using the word, right? So while many of these corporations have statements that document their intentions and kind of how they're going to go about doing this, when it comes to the use of the term, there's no third-party verification system in place to make sure that they're putting their money where their mouth is, or their plow is, I guess. So it gets a little bit concerning when you have, some of these larger corporations that are making these claims, but we don't really have any way of verifying it. And so this is where I get really excited, because while those corporations don't necessarily have anything in place so that we can, as consumers, can look at it and really get some of that reassurance that they're doing what they're saying that they're doing, there are some really great regenerative agriculture initiatives that are out there right now. And so the first one that I wanted to talk about, and I should say that, the great thing about these initiatives, there's two that I'm going to be talking about, but the great thing about them is that they're verified, right? So they're third-party verified, but mostly that they provide really clear, measurable definitions of what regenerative agriculture means to them, whether or not those are the same across the board. I think that it's more important that they provide a definition that is then tangible and measurable, and also that they're providing a form of transparency and accountability for their members. So the first one that I wanted to talk about is Regenerative Organic Certified. And so this was developed in partnership with the Rodale Institute. It was formed in 2017 by a group of farmers, business leaders, and agronomists, and experts in soil health, animal welfare, and social fairness. And it's collectively called the Regenerative Organic Alliance. This is a neat program. It's established as an independent international certification program, but it's based in the States. So this was the Rodale Institute that first founded this, and they use the USDA organic or a recognized equivalent. So the Canadian organic regime would be a recognized equivalent as their basis. So this is really an organic plus system, meaning that you have to already be certified as organic in order to be able to claim regenerative organic certification. Their standards focus on the three main pillars that I kind of talked about a little bit more previously. So that was the soil health, but they also include social welfare and animal welfare and social fairness. The neat thing about this particular system is that it's tiered. So they have bronze, silver, and gold levels, and these indicate operations that are at different stages of their regenerative certification. So for your bronze, to claim certification at the bronze level, you have to have at least 10% of your fiber or food producing land within the operation has to be certified. And then their goal is that you then have at least 50% of that operation certified by year 5. To get silver, you have to have at least 50% of your land with using ROC crops. And then by the 5th year, you have to have at least 75%. And then in order to get gold level certification, you have to have 100% of your fiber or food producing land that is certified. So this is kind of an interesting program, and I will have some links so that you can take a look at this one a little bit more at the end. This particular program, a couple of years back, I actually did a comparison report where because they have standards, it's very similar to our Canadian organic standards in that they have various sections and they have specific regulations that come with each of these different sections. And so I actually did a comparison where I looked at the various different regenerative organic certified standards, and I compared them to the Canadian organic standards. If anyone is interested in seeing that comparison, just let me know, and I'd be happy to share it with you. So yeah, while I do, and we were just talking about, I was just talking about different corporations that are maybe a little bit, I don't want to say less trustworthy, but ones that I'm a little bit skeptical of their claims for regenerative agriculture. I do also think that it's important to be to promote those that are working towards regenerative agriculture. And so with this particular program, I thought it was interesting to note that Legend Organic Farm, which is the farm that is owned by the founder of Nature's Path Organics, if you're familiar with that company. They participated in the Regenerative Organic Certification pilot program back in 2019, and they actually achieved silver ROC status, and were one of the first in the world and the largest of its kind to actually receive ROC certification. So this is where I think it's really exciting that you will have some of these larger corporations that kind of sign on and prescribe to some of these verifiable regenerative agriculture certification processes. And so the second initiative that I want to talk about, which I'll have to be careful because I could probably talk about this for forever because I find it really interesting. So this is the Ecological Verification Outcome Program. It's their land to market program. It was developed by the Savory Institute and it was established in 2018. And why I think that this is so important is because this program is outcome based. So it was developed in collaboration again with soil scientists and ecologists and agronomists. And it's really exciting because this is a practical and scalable soil and landscape assessment methodology. And it essentially tracks outcomes of biodiversity, soil health, ecosystem functions. So this is everything from like water cycle, mineral cycle, and energy flow on a producer's farm. And so the ecological outcomes verification, I'm going to shorten that to EOV because it's way easier to say, but it applies to things like grassland environments, which can include everything from natural to planted grasslands, grasslands mixed with crops, forested areas, and then farms that demonstrate a positively trending outcome in land regeneration. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a little bit. But farms that kind of demonstrate this positively trending outcome through EOV, they're entered into what's called a verified regenerative supplier roster. And so this roster is something through which participating buyers, brands, and retailers, and then eventually end consumers can access products and services that have been produced on a verified regenerative land base. So where I think this is really kind of unique, and it's nice to see initiatives like this that are coming out. I think that there's a lot to be said for applying a new solution to an age-old problem. So rather than being practice-based, like your standards, where you have kind of a set of practices and you're expected to follow them, EOV is outcome-based. And so essentially this means that verification is assessed through measurements of really tangible and empirical outcomes, which in turn provide farmers ongoing feedback in order to make better management decisions. So the premise of EOV is that it measures and trends key indicators of ecosystem health and function at the beginning of the program. And so it's based on this idea of monitoring. This initial assessment basically indicates whether there's any kind of indication towards, as I mentioned, this positive or negative trends in the overall health of your landscape. Rather than kind of your traditional top-down assessment tool, the program is designed to facilitate really continuous improvement and peer support for land managers. And so this is done through a network of regional hubs. And they have kind of these mentors who work with farmers and ranchers, and they're given areas, and they provide training and coaching, and they help with the implementation to really support producers in reaching their ecological outcome goals. The neat thing about it is that the hubs are regional, meaning that all of your mentors are really deeply knowledgeable of the local ecology. And so your recommendations are tailored to your local operating conditions and management approaches. And so as you can see, the program is broken down across baseline, short-term, and long-term monitoring objectives. And so a farm monitoring plan will have short-term monitoring stations, and they're distributed around your farm. And then this includes kind of permanent transects and photo points. So for each farmer, they'll have these kind of, within their plan, they'll have everything set up. And this will be done with their mentor. And it really ensures that when you're looking at monitoring, it's done in such a way that it's consistent and verifiable. And so you have your baseline assessment where your original mentor comes out and they establish what you would consider to be your baseline biodiversity and ecological kind of scope. And then you have short-term monitoring that occurs through years 1 to 4. And this is criteria that's based on what they call leading indicators of ecological health. And so these indicators they really have a predictive value about the direction of changes. So these are things that you can think of, like live canopy abundance, the plant litter incorporation throughout your soil, whether or not you have bare soil, wind erosion, water erosion, contextually desirable, so like invasive species or native plants, all of these kind of things that can be thought of as good indicators of what your overall ecosystem health are like. And then they also have these ideas of long-term monitoring, which includes all of that, but it also has these the addition of lagging indicators, which are indicators for land regeneration. So these are things like canopy cover by species, key biodiversity indicators, water infiltration, soil carbon, and soil equivalent fixed mass. So the key thing about these lagging indicator values is that they don't really offer a farmer a chance for really speedy correction, but they do provide really strong validation on the ecosystem health and the function of various ecosystem processes. So in essence, the program is broken down across different years. In the first year, you have a verifier from your hub who comes out and does a farm visit, and they establish your monitoring sites and your baseline data. And then through years 1 to 4, you have, and then again from years 6 until 9, you have your regional accredited monitors that come out and visit the farms. They conduct an annual short-term monitoring. If the results are trending positive, and so they come out every single year, if your results are trending positive, so you've got these indicators that what the practices that you're doing are improving the overall ecosystem on your farm in the context of your ecoregion, they grant you verification or renew it when they come back the next year. And then the farm is entered into this land to market verified regenerative supplier roster. And so through this program, farmers can undergo training and accreditation by their hub, and then they can also in turn kind of create this peer mentoring process where they go in and both do it on their own farm, but also provide some of these kind of benefits for other local farmers. And then in years 5 and 10, and so basically at every 5-year intervals, the regional hub verifier comes back and they return to the farm, they do their long-term monitoring, and then if this data trends positive, verification is granted again, and they remain on the land to market verified roster. So I think that I'll wrap it up because I've been talking for a little bit. But so some of these initiatives I think are really exciting to see. The ROC and the EOV are two really exciting kind of programs that have gained a lot of traction over recent years. The unfortunate thing, there are, as far as I know, some certification options for the ROC within Canada. I know that we do have a handful of regenerative organic certified farms that are in Canada. Unfortunately, when it comes to the ecological outcomes verification program, that one has not made it all the way up here to any real kind of big scale yet. And so when I like to think about looking forward, I would really like to see some of these programs get expanded upon. I think that they hold a lot of potential, whether you're looking at a certification-based program like the ROC, or you're looking at a little bit more of an organic one that is trying to really foster the health of your farm and your soil through the ecological outcomes verification program. I think I really wanted to get across with this is that when we think about the term regenerative, that there's a lot that we need to think about, and that at present this term is used fairly loosely. And so, when it comes to looking at claims from various corporations, or perhaps where you're spending your money at the grocery store, the term regenerative, I think there's still some work to be done with how we define it and how we regulate it. I think that it's less problematic when we're looking at small scale farming, because you can talk to a small scale farmer and you can learn about different regenerative practices that they're implementing. But overall, in many ways, it's more of a philosophy than it is kind of anything else. And so personally, I'm very excited to see where things like the ecological outcomes verification program leads to, and how that kind of gets expanded and scaled to a larger regions and audiences. So I did throw up some resources on here in case anybody is interested in looking at some of these programs a little bit more. Yeah, I'd be very happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Well, thank you, Emma. That was really great. That was really informative. There's lots of information there. And just to let all of our attendees know, there'll be a recording of this available probably in the next couple days as well, if anyone wants to review all of that information. Oh, I do see a question in the chat. Someone has asked, are there certain types of crops or plants that are particularly good for soil?
That's a good question. So yes, I mean, I think that you can think about this particular question a couple different ways. And that kind of looks at what your overall hope is for when it comes to doing something to the soil. So when it comes to cover crops, which is a really big one, any of your legume cover crops are going to fixate nitrogen into your soil. So these are things like clover, vetch is another one, anything along those lines. When it comes to, if you say maybe want to improve the structure of your soil, there are any of your deep-rooted, things with the taproot. So those would be things like your large radish crops. So there's tapper radishes that are really good for breaking up a more compacted soil structure. And then you can either let them decompose, or in my case, sometimes I will let my pigs root them up. But anything along those lines is really good. I'd say that if you're looking for adding nutrients into your soil, your legumes are probably your best bet for doing that.
Okay, great. Well, if anybody else has any questions, they can type it into the chat. And I would just like to say thank you again to Emma, and thank you to everyone for attending. I hope everyone enjoyed this webinar. We will be sending out a webinar feedback survey. So if anyone wants to let us know what you thought of this webinar, we'd really appreciate that. And if anyone is a farmer or a landowner or a horse owner in the Langley and Abbotsford areas, we have another survey related to water quality in these areas that LEPS would really appreciate if people in those areas would be willing to fill that survey out as well. And I see Carol might have a question there.
No, I just wanted to express my appreciation for the subject and the explanation. I'm much enlightened.
Thanks, Carol. I don't know if anybody else gets as excited about the EOV program as I do, but I highly recommend checking it out, because I personally think that that's a really interesting way that that this can move forward in a fashion that is not cookie cut, to kind of something that is tailored to each individual operation.
Yeah, that one was sort of the outcome-based one. That sounds like a really good way to do it. Like actually make sure that like we're doing the thing that we're setting out to do, not just performative, I guess.
There's definitely I have seen articles that have been written that are talking about farms that have gone in and kind of applied these blanket regenerative practices where they're looking at no-till specifically being a big one. And at the end of the day, it actually made things worse for them. Especially when you're thinking about no-till and you're not using synthetic pesticides, weed management is really difficult. And so this idea of really tailoring things to individual operations and then having it be outcome based, where you're doing monitoring and you're checking back and you're trying to develop long-term management plans that are based off of the feedback that you're getting from the land. I think that there's a lot of potential in that one.
Yeah. Great. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat. So if no one else has any more questions, I guess I'll just say once again, thanks so much, Emma. This was a really great, really informative presentation. And thank you to all of our attendees who came to listen. I hope you really enjoyed it. And LEPS will be hosting more webinars in the near future. So keep an eye on our website and our social media for more great topics like this.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Bye.